working on this for years. We've been talking about doing this
Mhm.
program, and the book is out. Neither of us anticipated the events we've seen in the Middle East in the last couple of weeks. And I thought for a minute, gee, does it make sense to continue to do this while all that's still uh,
Mhm.
going on? Everybody's focused on that. And the more I thought about it, I said, absolutely. First of all, it's not like the only issue of hate that's absorbing us. And the book is an important one. So I think we could all have a capacity to focus on, immediate concerns around the world, but also to think about the issues that this important book raises for all of us. And as I put in the email that many of you saw, I mean, for me, it was an instructive effort for Sam to put this book together and a pleasure to read because growing up in the Vietnam War era, I mean, I thought of Hubert Humphrey as somebody who was, as Johnson's vice president, was very much of a supporter of the war effort, at least in contrast to Gene McCarthy and others in the 68 Democratic Convention. So that's sort of what I knew, but I sort of knew that there was this background to this liberal aspect of him that preceded the Vietnam War years. And Sam, mentions in the book the Tom Lehrer song
Mhm.
about about whatever became of Hubert. If you folks don't know Tom Lehrer, you're missing out on a whole bunch of things, and check him out. But that's I sort of knew that background, but it was a pleasure to really dive deeply into that. And I think Sam does a tremendous job going to the background, what drove Hubert Humphrey to do this, and the political moment that Sam highlights, which is incredibly important, and I think resonates with some of the things we're seeing even today. Is what we're seeing in the Republican Party, even though it was the Democratic Party that had those fissures back then. So let me just give a brief bio of Sam. Well, Sam, I think we probably met, God, I'm thinking like 1988, as I first recall,
Yeah,
lunch with you. A long time.
that seems about
Uh,
right.
yeah, he's an award-winning author, journalist, and educator. He's been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, and has won the National Jewish Book Award and the New York Public Library's Helen Bernstein Award. His columns for the New York Times about education and religion have received national prizes. He's a professor at Columbia University and has been named the nation's outstanding journalism educator by the Society of Professional Journalists. And what we're going to do is Sam's going to speak for about 30 minutes or so. Then I'm going to pose questions to him. Please don't feel that you need to wait to put questions in the Q&A. And then we'll finish the discussion and close at the top of the hour. So Sam, the floor is all yours.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Ken. And unfortunately, even irrespective of the tragedies occurring in the Middle East right now, this would have been a unfortunately timely look back in history because of the amount of domestic hatred we're dealing with these days. But in that respect, it also, I think, is a case of the past being prologue in some ways that are harrowing, but also some that I think can give us cause for some reasoned optimism. And I want to start by talking about the way we look at the past and the gaps, both historical and biographical, I've tried to fill in this book. When we think about the civil rights movement, we tend to place its origins in the 1950s. When we think about Thurgood Marshall there on the steps of the Supreme Court building, winning the Brown versus Board of Education case that outlawed school segregation, and Dr. King on the bottom left of the screen, and Rosa Parks leading the Montgomery bus boycott. And, it's true that those events in the mid 50s are vitally important, and they lead to many other epic moments in the civil rights saga of the freedom rides and the lunch counter sit-ins and the March on Washington and the Poor People's March and so on. But it's an incomplete history. And similarly, and this goes to what Ken was saying at the start, when people think about Humphrey, if they think about him at all now, they tend to think of him as this person who seems so dominated by Lyndon Johnson. And you can see in the photo, Johnson's giving him what was sometimes called the Johnson treatment, physically intimidating other people. And Humphrey supported the Vietnam War, I think not totally out of loyalty to Johnson. Humphrey was also a cold warrior, but that broke with a lot of his liberal base over many years. And then he got the party's nomination to run for president in 1968 amid the police riot in Chicago against anti-war protesters and journalists. And then in 1972, ran for the party's nomination as the establishment candidate, kind of worn out and weary and keeping secret from the public how ill with cancer he was, running against George McGovern, who was the hero of the anti-war movement and, the exciting leader of young voters. And all that led people to have a very caustic view of Humphrey that has lasted to this day. And it's not, again, that there's anything incorrect about those perceptions of Humphrey and the reason for that caustic view, but it's an incomplete view. Because going back to the civil rights movement, we wouldn't have had the movement that we erroneously think begins in the 1950s if it hadn't been for the civil rights movement of the 1940s. And that's a movement that's led by people like A. Philip Randolph on the bottom right from the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and Walter White next to him, the executive secretary of the NAACP. And it's a movement that is really given its moral force by the Black GIs who go to war on behalf of this country that at best treats them as second-class citizens and often not as human beings at all. And the Black GIs came up with this concept they called double V, and you can see the logo on one of the photos. And that meant victory over fascism abroad and then victory over Jim Crow at home. And similarly, Hubert Humphrey has this remarkable decade of activism in the 1940s that has largely been lost to history, almost all of which takes place when he's rising into public life in Minneapolis, ultimately in the middle of the decade, winning the mayoralty and catapulting from the record he builds on civil rights and human rights in Minneapolis to become a national leader in the party, which brings him to the Democratic National Convention in 1948, which for reasons I'll get to shortly, is the crescendo of this book and is a completely overlooked and underappreciated landmark in civil rights history. But to put all this in perspective, you have to understand that in many ways, Hubert Humphrey would have been the least likely person to be a leader in the battles against both racism and anti-Semitism in this country, because Hubert Humphrey grows up in this remote, insular, isolated place, Dolan, South Dakota. You can see it there about 15 years before his family moves there in the 19-teens. Dolan is a town of 500 out in the wheat belt of South Dakota, hundreds of miles from the Twin Cities, which is the closest metropolis. And Humphrey's family runs the local drugstore out there. You can see Hubert at the counter. And for a period of time when wheat prices are high, they are prosperous and they live in the fanciest house in town, which you can see with Humphrey and his couple of his siblings on the front lawn. And the reason it's the most prosperous family's home is that 1,000 miles from any ocean, it has a widow's walk. So that kind of affectation. And there's an amazing event that happens when Humphrey is 11 years old that in some ways points the direction of his life. So as I mentioned, Dolan was this incredibly far-flung place, and it was at the mercy for many years of the railroad company that had set it up. So all the farmers sent their grain and their livestock into the Twin Cities by the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, which had a monopoly over prices. And so when Humphrey's 11 years old, and you can see him at exactly that age with the family dog there, the big news in Dolan is that there's going to be a gravel road put in, the first gravel road ever. That's going to relieve some of the physical isolation and some of the economic vulnerability of Dolan. And amazingly, in Dolan, which is an entirely white Protestant community, the subcontractor doing the graveling job is a Black-owned company out of Omaha, owned by 2 of the 3 Black men in that photograph, Leslie and Otis Shipman, who are brothers. And this is the way they did the graveling, with this horse-drawn crew. And of course, in a place that was as homogeneous as Dolan was, the arrival of Black road workers was going to get noticed in the local paper, as I found in my research. And Humphrey no doubt read that account. And Humphrey went out to meet that road crew. He went out there, I think, very much because he was his father's son. And his father, H.H., in addition to running the family drugstore, was the resident idealist and contrarian in Doland. He was a liberal Democrat in a town full of conservative Republicans. He was an agnostic in a town full of people who went to church either because they believed or because they wanted to fit in. And he would always say to Hubert Humphrey when talking about different kinds of people, if you treat people like dogs, expect to get bitten. And Humphrey, being his father's son, goes out and introduces himself to that road crew. And he befriends them and they befriend him. And at the end of the week of their work in Doland, when they're coming into town on Saturday night with their week's pay, they buy all these extra newspapers that Hubert Humphrey peddles. His work for the drugstore is for free, so his side hustle selling newspapers is the only way he can make a little money. And they buy all these extra papers, so he'll have a good week of sales. And they take him to the pool hall in town, which since Doland is dry, the pool hall is as transgressive as it gets. And then the road crew goes on to their next job somewhere in Iowa. But Hubert Humphrey never forgets that encounter. He brings it up when he's dictating the oral history that will become the basis of his autobiography in the mid-1960s, 40 years later, 45 years later. It stayed with him that much. And it's not that I think anyone who meets and befriends some Black folk in their childhood is bound to be an advocate for civil rights, but it tells you something essential about Humphrey's temperament. And Humphrey is able to go to the University of Minnesota, can see one of the campus buildings bottom right, in 1929, which it proves to be terrible timing because he's just a month into his college studies when the stock market crashes and the whole country is plunged into the Depression. The Humphreys have lost their home by this time. Their drugstore has gone broke. They moved to a different town in South Dakota to try to start over. And Humphrey has to drop out of college to help them and to hurriedly get a pharmacy license and go to work in their new family drugstore, where he experiences the dust storms and the bank failures and the mass unemployment and everything else we associate with the Depression, but also where he begins to see, after Franklin Roosevelt's election in 1932, the role of activist government in trying to ameliorate some of the hardship. And really, Humphrey becomes a New Dealer at this early point in his life. And that's reinforced in 1935 when he makes his first trip to Washington. Humphrey's sister Frances, there in the bottom left, is an amazing person. His younger sister chronologically, but his older sister in terms of influence. And when she saw that Hubert and another brother, Ralph, had been forced to drop out of college to help the family, she realizes, if they're not putting the boys through college, they're sure not going to let me stay in college. She just finished her first year at a local college in South Dakota. So incredibly, she gets, train fare together and travels all the way to Washington where an uncle lives, puts herself through George Washington University, becomes a protege as a young social worker of Eleanor Roosevelt. And in the summer of 1935, Hubert Humphrey's planning to visit Washington because he's a scoutmaster, and the first National Scouting Jamboree ever is supposed to be held in DC that summer. But there is a polio outbreak, so it's canceled, but he goes to DC anyway. And when he's there, he's astonished to go to the Smithsonian and visit the monuments and see Congress in session and see the New Deal in action. And he's writing several times every day to his then girlfriend, bottom right, Muriel Buck, later his wife, Muriel Humphrey, and saying, I know you're going to think I'm crazy, but I feel like this is what I should be doing. I should be going up the steps of the Capitol and being in Congress and being in public service. And she writes back to him and says, your dream is my dream, but the only way you're going to have your dream is if you leave your father's drugstore. Because H.H., though idealistic in many ways, was kind of a dominating and domineering father who had very improbable political ambitions of his own. He thought he'd get to be governor of South Dakota. And he wanted Hubert Humphrey to work on his behalf. And it's only because Muriel really stiffens Hubert Humphrey's spine that he ultimately does extricate himself from the family drugstore. He goes back with her, and soon with their first child, Nancy, to Minneapolis to finish his bachelor's degree at the University of Minnesota after a 5-year absence. And in 1939, at the age of 28, he finally has his bachelor's degree, and he resolves he wants to go on to graduate school, thinking he'll have a career as a professor. And this leads to the most important year in Hubert Humphrey's life, the year that makes him the person we recognize at his best. Humphrey ends up going to graduate school at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. And the only reason he goes there is that LSU is offering him a graduate assistantship of $400. And I've done the conversion. That's equivalent to $8,500 now. So it's a sizable amount of money. And he and Muriel and Nancy need that money. So they go down to Baton Rouge in September of 1939. And Huey Long, who you can see there in a typically voluble pose, before his assassination, the populist and demagogue of Louisiana had made great efforts to make LSU a more academically respectable institution. And it brought a lot of new dealers into its new department of government, as they called it. And that also is part of why Humphrey is attracted there. But what happens in that year at LSU is, first of all, Humphrey is living in a Jim Crow society for the first time. Baton Rouge is about 1/3 Black, and where Hubert and Muriel and Nancy live on the edge of downtown is separated by 1.5 miles from the LSU campus. And in between is the biggest Black neighborhood in Baton Rouge, nicknamed the Bottoms. So every day Humphrey's going back and forth twice a day through the Bottoms. And in that commute, he's seeing at a granular level Black life. And of course, he sees the things and is appalled by the things we associate with Jim Crow, the back of the bus, the separate water fountains, the separate waiting rooms, and so on. But it's actually these individual moments of degradation that have the biggest impact on him. When he sees a Black pedestrian who's crossing the street too slowly for a white motorist's satisfaction, and sees the white driver get out of his car and just rain down the N-word on that Black pedestrian, or when he's there with one of his professors in the state capitol building that Huey Long had built, which in Long's grandiosity had built a high-rise tower in a city with no high-rises. So there are elevators in the building, and Humphrey notices all the Black people waiting and waiting and waiting in the lobby, fearful of getting into the elevator if there's a white person in it, fearful of what the retaliation might be like if they did so. So Humphrey is just at a very primal level offended by what segregation is. The second thing that happens in Baton Rouge, and this is less predictable than it being a big Black community, is that Humphrey makes Jewish friends for the first time in his life. And one of his buddies on the debating team is a young law student named Arthur Alvin Rubin, birth name Avraham Rabinovitz, who's the child of a Lithuanian Jewish immigrant. And in the course of their friendship, one of the things that Rubin talks about to Humphrey is that his father's 5 brothers, so his 5 paternal uncles, are all trapped in Lithuania, which is now being squeezed by both the Soviets and the Nazis as they're carving up Eastern Europe. And he expresses, Rubin does, his fear for his uncle's survival. And in fact, all of them will be exterminated by the Nazis. And this is the beginning of Humphrey understanding 2 things that will guide a lot of his later life. Number one, the plight of Jews in Europe and also in this country. Number 2, the importance of intervening. Remember, at this time in the late 30s, isolationism is a consensus opinion in the United States. Charles Lindbergh, nativist right is isolationist, but because now the Soviets are the Nazis' allies, the left, the Popular Front left, has now switched from saying we're, the tip of the anti-fascist spear to saying we're not going to fight in this capitalist war. And yet Humphrey, partly inspired by Rubin, is beginning to become an interventionist. And the person who ties it all together for Humphrey is the man smoking the pipe, Rudolf Eberle. And Eberle is a anti-Nazi professor from Europe, from Germany, who had been so distressed by the rise of the Nazis that he began doing research to explain to himself how this country that he thought was so cultured and so enlightened and so tolerant could embrace dictatorship within a couple of years. And on top of the way that scholarship runs afoul of the Nazis who are now controlling Germany's universities, when Humphrey is forced to provide his family tree per Nazi law, it reveals a Jewish great-grandparent. So even though his family had converted to Christianity long before, in Nazi Germany, 1/8 Jewish is Jewish. And so for both of those reasons, he's stripped of his academic position, his assets are seized, and he ends up going into exile, and with his wife and 3 children winds up on the docks of Baltimore in 1938, wondering, where do I go and what do I do? And LSU, to its credit, gave him an academic position. Initially, not a full professorship, an instructor's position, but a way to teach and to support his family. And in the seminar that Humphrey takes with Aberle talks about what he found in his research, and Aberle talks about his family's own experience of dispossession and refugee life. And he talks about the parallel between the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany and the Jim Crow treatment of Blacks in the American South. And he finally throws down the gauntlet to his dozen students one day, and Humphrey will remember decades later what Aberle said. And what he did say was, if we were in Germany, maybe 2 of you would have stood up to the Nazis. And I think Humphrey takes that challenge to heart. I think it becomes a mission statement for him, that he's not going to be an appeaser. He's not going to be an accommodationist. He's not going to be complacent in the face of evil. And then he finishes his year at LSU. And because the LSU government program ends with a master's degree, he goes back to Minneapolis to work on his doctorate, but really very soon to go into public life. And, a lot of Northern New Deal types would have gone back to the North and wiped their brow and said, I'm so glad I'm out of the benighted, racist South and back in the enlightened, tolerant North. Humphrey, it's the opposite. He now can see what's been hiding in plain sight in Minneapolis all along. And what's hiding in plain sight in Minneapolis is a ferociously bigoted city. During the 1930s, even the years of that decade when Humphrey was in college, he was oblivious to it, but he sees it now. And what has been going on and what he's catching up to with his moral vision are, for instance, the photo of these well-dressed people out on the lawn. They're besieging the home that a Black postal worker just bought in the summer of 1931, night after night, until they managed to drive the family out, surrounding the house, thousands of white Christian people in Minneapolis. And they're well-dressed, they're proud of what they're doing. They don't think of themselves as vigilantes and bigots. They think they're protecting their race. And if you look at the upper right, the logo gear that those young men are wearing, that's a group called the Silver Legion, better known as the Silver Shirts, explicitly modeled on Hitler's paramilitary brown shirts. And the Silver Shirts had a steady welcome in Minneapolis. They met there often, and they attracted not only the riffraff and the resentful, dispossessed working class during the Depression, but they would have the president of the Board of Ed at their meetings. They would have the president of the Businessmen's Association at their meetings, doctors, lawyers, dentists, teachers. They had mainstream acceptance. And then we have Charles Lindbergh, Minneapolis' own aviation hero, who, of course, was the public most treacherous face, because he was such a hero around the country, of isolationism and anti-Semitism. Lindbergh, who notoriously said in Iowa that people who wanted to get the Jews, and of course for him, Jews and bankers were synonymous anyway. And finally, bottom right, the most prominent minister in Minneapolis, Reverend William Bell Riley, protege of Jennings Bryan, later mentor, and an erudite, refined institution builder, created a missionary training program, a publishing house, and Riley was a true believer in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, that notorious Tsarist era forgery that claimed that Jews were going to run the world. And Riley preached about it, wrote about it unapologetically, And because of his stature in Minneapolis, he sanitized it. He made that anti-Semitic calumny part of respectable discourse in Minneapolis. And that was the city Humphrey came to in 1940. But to continue the moral education he'd gotten in Baton Rouge, he needed more teachers, and he found them. These two men, Cecil Newman, former Pullman porter who had founded, published, and edited several newspapers and magazines, most importantly, the Minneapolis Spokesman, which to this day is still being published in Minneapolis and edited by his granddaughter. Next to Cecil Newman, his good friend, Sam Shiner. Sam Shiner was a Jew who'd gotten a law degree and couldn't find a law firm to hire him, and was making his living playing jazz piano in the nightclubs until at the time of those Silver Shirts meetings in the late 30s, the Jewish community was so alarmed both by the meetings and by the dismissive, blasé attitude of establishment in Minneapolis about those meetings that they raised enough money to pay Sam Shiner a salary to be basically a one-man anti-defamation league, really keeping intelligence on the very large number of anti-Semites and racists in the Twin Cities. And Cecil Newman's role had been through the pages of his newspaper to call out all the forms of racism in Minneapolis, police brutality that anticipates George Floyd's murder tragically, labor unions that wouldn't have Black members, breweries that wouldn't hire Black workers, the coded language that the mainstream newspapers would use when they wrote about the Black community, which meant really only writing about Blacks in relationship with crime and vice. And Newman and Shiner had been really waging these lonely, almost one-man battles against racism and anti-Semitism, and had never had an important ally for their cause. Because Black Minneapolis and Jewish Minneapolis together comprised maybe 3% of the population. Those communities didn't have the critical mass to flex political muscle. And then Hubert Humphrey gets to town, and they teach Humphrey, but what Humphrey connects them to is someone who's political ambition and political skills, and they've never had that before. So this triad of Newman and Shiner and Humphrey is essential to what Humphrey's going to accomplish moving forward. And keep in mind that the other part of life in Minneapolis in the 30s and early 40s is the emerging final solution in Europe, the Nazi hegemony over Europe, and Kristallnacht and the early concentration camps, and the propaganda feat of the 36 Olympics. And all of that is also part of the ambient radiation. And so similarly, when America finally goes to war belatedly after Pearl Harbor in 1941, for both Black GIs and Jewish GIs, this is seen as a two-part battle. I'd already mentioned the idea of double victory from Black GIs. Well, Jewish GIs didn't have a phrase quite that pithy, but they had the same idea that you go to war to defeat the Nazis who are murdering your people, and then you come back and you leverage your sacrifice for the battle against anti-Semitism at home. And you make use of what was created during World War II and what was erroneously and deliberately mistitled the Judeo-Christian tradition. It wasn't a tradition. It was invented for wartime morale, but it was going to be very useful in the battle against post-war anti-Semitism on the home front. And Humphrey is never able to get into the war, and it really frustrates him. He very much wanted to serve, but he had 3 young children. He also had a double hernia, and he kept on getting deferments. But when he would talk and write to friends of his who were serving, repeatedly, they would write back to him, your battle's on the home front. We can find other people to shoot the rifles, but there are battles to be won against hatred at home, and you're uniquely situated to do that. And I think Humphrey took strength from that. I think it answered a question that was nagging him, which is, what's my role? How am I letting down my country by not being on the battlefield? And what they said to him is, there's another battlefield for you, and it's right in Minneapolis. And so Humphrey makes his first run for mayor in 1943, and he does it as a somewhat conventional candidate. He's running with the backing of organized labor. He's running, I'm going to clean up the crime downtown. He's running emphasizing his Norwegian ancestry, which makes sense in a heavily Scandinavian city like Minneapolis. And he narrowly loses. But when he comes back and runs 2 years later in 1945, he's explicitly running as a candidate for civil rights and human rights. During the campaign, there's a wave of mob attacks against young Jewish kids, teenagers, and children in the main Jewish neighborhood. And remarkably, it's happening against the backdrop of the first newsreels and English language articles in the mainstream press documenting the Holocaust. You would think that if there was ever a time there wouldn't be such attacks, it would be then. But the opposite is true. And the mayor of Minneapolis is complacent as usual about it, just thinks it's teenage hooligans. So does his police chief. Humphrey is the one who says, this city has been warned repeatedly for decades that it has a problem with hatred. And it was bound to become violent, and now it has. And that message, even with just 3% of Minneapolis being Black or Jewish, catches on. Because I think with the war's end and with those revelations and with the return of GIs to the Twin Cities and to the University of Minnesota, there's a receptivity to the idea that the last part of World War II will be taking on bigotry at home. And amazingly, Humphrey wins, and you can see Cecil Newman's headline exulting, saying it did happen here. And when Humphrey comes into office, he has a twofold approach on civil rights and human rights. He wants to change laws, and he also wants to change minds. He wants to change laws by moving forward on one of the strongest employment discrimination laws in the whole United States that really 20 years ahead of time anticipates the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that he and LBJ will help bring about in the mid-1960s. And he moves forward against housing discrimination. And he moves forward on police reform. He, in the 1940s, is sending the entire Minneapolis police force for training at the University of Minnesota in what was then called human relations. He's requiring every officer in the city to carry the city's human relations ordinance with them on duty. And one of the sad effects of Humphrey's rapid ascent into the Senate after just 3 years as mayor is his police reform agenda is never completed. And that's why Derek Chauvin's knee is on George Floyd's neck. And in addition to changing laws, Humphrey tries to change minds by making Minneapolis study itself. And he brings in this remarkable sociologist from Fisk University, the HBCU in Nashville, that would later educate Diane Nash and John Lewis of the Freedom Movement. This man, Charles Johnson, comes to Minneapolis, recruits hundreds of volunteers, and they do both statistical and anecdotal surveys of the depth of prejudice in Minneapolis, and they document incontrovertibly with what we would now call a data set, how entrenched the racism, the anti-Semitism, and other forms of intolerance are in the city. And when Humphrey's able to force Minneapolis to look at itself in the mirror, that also gives him some political force for his civil rights and human rights program. And even though Humphrey's a popular mayor, there's plenty of opposition to this. And so much so that at the very time Humphrey's inaugurating the self-survey, as it's called, of racism and anti-Semitism in Minneapolis, at the same time he's moving forward on his legislation, he comes home late one night in February 1947, and as he's trying to get into his house, fiddling with the key in his front door, 3 bullets whiz by his head. And these bullets were fired by this man on the screen, Maynard Orlando Nelson, who was a follower of that other man, pointing his finger, Gerald L.K. Smith, founder of the America First Party, the Donald Trump of his era, and someone who had a big following in Minneapolis, and someone who Humphrey had confronted in many ways. And because of those confrontations and because of Humphrey's civil and human rights agenda, Nelson set out to kill him. And the only reason I think he missed is that the Humphrey's pet dog had barked as he was getting ready to shoot and thrown off his concentration. And when the police finally arrest Nelson, they find, as you can see, his gun. What else but a German Luger? What else would a neo-Nazi have? And knives, bullets, correspondence with white supremacist groups around the country. And Humphrey, interestingly, doesn't bring charges against Nelson. I think that he didn't want to give him the chance to play the martyr at a trial. And he, I think, also hoped that because Nelson was arrested on other charges, that he'd leave town. And by the way, he did, but he left town in order to join the American Nazi Party in Chicago under George Lincoln Rockwell. Now, as Humphrey is fighting his battles in Minneapolis, this is becoming a national issue too. And with immense tragedy, Double V didn't come true. The sacrifice of Black soldiers in World War II didn't give them greater success calling for racial equality at home. If anything, the opposite is true. When Black GIs come back in uniforms and try to sit in the front of the railroad car or the bus or the train and try to walk through the front door of the restaurant and order food or try to drink from the white water fountain, they're subject to repeated attacks in the South, some of them lethal, but the one that will have the greatest effect on American public opinion involves this man, an Army sergeant named Isaac Woodard. And Woodard, when he sets foot off a bus in South Carolina, is set upon by the local sheriff, who gouges his eyes out with a nightstick. Rather than being humiliated and intimidated by that, Woodward goes on to become a national speaker for the cause of civil rights. And what happens to him gets to Harry Truman and affects Truman, even though Truman's shown no proclivity for civil rights until that point. And Truman begins to put forth a civil rights program, and he even addresses the NAACP at the Lincoln Memorial, the first president to do so. But then Truman looks at the calendar and sees November 1948. And he decides he's going to back away from his own civil rights agenda. He's going to revert to what FDR had always done, which was appease the South, placate the South, let them have Jim Crow, don't have anything about civil rights in the party platform. And that's his wish as the Democrats gather in July 1948 in Philadelphia during this sweltering week to hash out their platform. Because the nomination is a no-brainer. Harry Truman's going to get it. Most of the party expects he's going to lose, but the battle will be whether the Democratic Party at long last will embrace civil rights. Truman sends out the word he doesn't want the civil rights plank. In fact, when one of Truman's people on the convention floor hears about Humphrey's plan, he tells him, if you give that civil rights speech, your political career is over. And then we have these two men on the right. Upper right, Strom Thurmond from South Carolina. Bottom right, Fielding Wright, governor of Mississippi, who founded the Dixiecrat Party. And they've already threatened that if there's word one of civil rights in the party platform, they're going to walk out and run their own candidate for president, which they ultimately do. And then outside the convention hall, you have A. Philip Randolph leading protest marches. That's him with the sign that says prison is better than Army Jim Crow service, because he's been on a year-long campaign to persuade young Black men not to register for the draft and not to call up if served until Harry Truman desegregates the military. So this is the bubbling broth of the 1948 Democratic Convention. And the last faction there is Humphrey's faction of liberals, who have decided it's intolerable, it's morally inconsistent, and in fact, morally impossible that a party of liberalism should placate segregationists. It's morally impossible and geopolitically self-defeating for the United States at a time of Cold War battles against the Soviet Union, for the political allegiance of these soon-to-be decolonized countries around the world, to say that you should choose Western liberalism, even though it provides a wide berth for racial segregation. And with those two ideas in mind, Humphrey takes to give the speech of his life on July 14th, 1948. And over and against the threat it'll end his political career, and over against the promise by the Southerners to walk out, he gives this 10-minute speech that convinces the party to defy both Truman and the segregationists and endorse a civil rights plank that explicitly says desegregate the army, outlaw lynching, outlaw the poll tax, guarantee physical safety for Americans on the basis of not only race, but also religion and national origin. So this is a plank that's hugely important for Jews, for Catholics, for Nisei Japanese, for Chinese Americans, for Mexican Americans. And it carries the day. And what it does is it forces Harry Truman to do something he didn't want to do, which is run as the civil rights candidate. But 2 weeks after the convention, he desegregates the armed forces and desegregates the federal workforce. And on election day, he wins his upset victory over Tom Dewey for one and only one reason, because of a surge of Black voters in swing states. And the long tail of that election is still with us today. On the negative side, it's the moment when the Dixiecrats leave, when the former segregation, the Democratic Party's faction of segregationists begin their march into the Republican Party to ultimately become Goldwater, Nixon, Reagan, and now Trump Republicans. That's where the segregationists of 1948 and the Democratic Party have ended up. On the other side, this is the moment when the Democratic Party, having expelled the Southern segregationists, in effect, becomes the party we recognize now, that with all its flaws and inconsistencies, is the party of inclusive, interracial, interfaith democracy. In the mid-1960s, that yields the trio of landmark civil rights laws that Johnson and Humphrey and the mass movement led by Dr. King bring about. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1966. And it brings us 2 terms of Barack Obama, and now Hakeem Jeffries as Speaker, Kamala Harris as Vice President. So we're living with the positive effects of 1948 as well. But as we've learned the very, very, very hard way, it doesn't mean that we live in a world in which progress remains intact and unchallenged. We've seen in recent past the murder of George Floyd. We've seen the Unite the Right rally. We've seen the attempted coup in this country. And I think that at the most pessimistic, we might say, I guess that means Hubert Humphrey accomplished nothing if we're still fighting these battles. But I disagree with it. I think what it means is that American history is repeated cycles of oppression, resistance, liberation, progress, and inevitably backlash. And we have to continually fight to hold the ground we've won. And I think Humphrey understood that. One of his nicknames was the Happy Warrior, which is actually an epithet that was first applied to one of my other political heroes, Al Smith, the governor of New York, and really, in some ways, the creator of the New Deal even before FDR. But Humphrey was a worthy successor to bear that name. Now, people tend to remember when they talk about Hubert Humphrey as the Happy Warrior, the happy part. And sometimes that's actually a disparagement rather than a compliment. And they think that it signals naivete and corniness and, false optimism. I don't think so. I think Humphrey was an optimist, and he was an enthusiast, and he was a believer in the American promise. But the other part of Happy Warrior is warrior. And so before we go to questions, I want to leave you with the fact that Humphrey understood that what he called the politics of joy is only half of what
Sam, I think you froze. I think Sam disappeared. Um, which I'm glad he got through what he presented. But I'm sorry he disappeared. I'm going to try to get him to log on again. So bear with me. Anyway, so why don't we, in the meantime, populate some more questions and hopefully Sam will come back. Yeah, Sam lost the connection. People are asking about that. So then, I can't do justice for Sam's book, but let me answer at least a little bit until he does get back. And I hope he does. A couple of things. I see one question about, did Humphrey think the strong anti-Semitism was the product um, of the Nazi propaganda effort in the U.S.? If you read his book, and I encourage you to do that, the anti-Semitism he was writing about what predated that. It was the discrimination against people in the community. It was, as Sam was saying, what he saw in the South in terms of his experience with the professor, but he saw it living out in Minneapolis as well. And he thought of it as systemic, and that was an important part. One of the other things that Sam, when he was writing the book, he did an article in the Guardian that was very interesting. He was noticing that Gerald L.K. Smith, who he mentioned as the sort of firebrand, Trump-ish guy who was organizing at the time, was somebody who was very similar to Humphrey in his background, his middle class background and so forth, but came out in an entirely different place. And he came across this, term that was applied to Smith called patriotism, which again has a resonation in the current environment too. The idea that hate becomes the cornerstone of a patriotic view. You have to hate others to be a patriot, and that connects too. A couple of other. Oh, Sam, you're back. Hi.
I'm very sorry that I
It,
lost your
hap-
hope.
it happens. It happens. It's
How
okay.
long was it off for?
Oh, about 3 or 4 minutes. So I started
Oh, okay. All right,
answering
good.
answering a couple of what you basically finished.
Okay,
So, and
good.
I'll edit out the parts where I was trying to give what you would have answered. We can go on
Okay.
for a few minutes.
No,
It happens.
I appreciate everyone sticking around. I'm at a hotel in Washington. I think I hit the 24-hour mark for my first day of Wi-Fi. Oh my God. All right.
And in the world's problems, this is the least.
Yeah, it is a
So,
first world problem.
yeah. But anyway, so I'm glad you got to finish the remarks before that happened. Let me see if you get the same answer I did to this question. Did Humphrey think the strongest anti-Semitism was the product of the Nazi propaganda effort in the U.S.?
I don't think that I didn't find anything in which he attributed it more to one thing than another. I think he was certainly aware, particularly in Minneapolis, of pro-Nazi sentiment, but I think he was also very acutely aware of Christian-oriented anti-Semitism. He had this amazing, I talked about some of his confrontations with Gerald L.K. Smith, and at one of them, when Smith wanted to give a speech at the municipal auditorium in Minneapolis, and he needed city council approval to do it, Humphrey said to Smith, who, keep in mind, was an ordained minister and always was presenting himself as being a great Christian, said to Smith, "You can't be a good Christian and hate Jews because Jesus was a Jew." And these days, asserting the historical Jewishness of Jesus is a no-brainer. But in the 1940s, that was a very risky thing to say. And I think that what it illustrates is that Humphrey had also very acute awareness of how religious justifications for anti-Semitism were particularly virulent. And I don't find anything where he tried to sort of tease apart where, a religious justification for anti-Semitism ends and a view of Jews as being Bolshevik revolutionaries begins, and then where that ends, and a view of Jews as rapacious capitalists begin. A lot of the anti-Semites in Minneapolis, and there were a great many of them, I think held all of those beliefs.
And I was mentioned just before you came back about that Guardian article you wrote with, I thought, the term that was beautiful about Smith, who we were just talking about patriotism.
Patriots,
Patriot.
right. That was Walter Winchell came up with that term, and for people like Smith, and it's so accurate. And unfortunately, still to this day, people who are really demagogues who are appealing to hatred and divisiveness, but wrap themselves in the trappings of the flag and patriotism to do it. But of course, what they're offering is a lethally exclusionary view of who gets to be an American.
So another question, people feel free to add more, is what might a Humphrey administration been like if he had won in 1968?
Well, one thing for sure, the Vietnam War would have ended much sooner and with a much greater much less loss of life of American soldiers and of the Vietnamese themselves. Humphrey, even though he had backed the war for most of the time he was vice president, had come out during his campaign for peace talks and a bombing halt. And I don't know how many of your people on the webinar know this, but one of Nixon's pre-Watergate dirty tricks was to secretly go to the South Vietnamese president and say, don't participate in those peace talks. If I get elected, I'll cut you a better deal. And so the South Vietnamese backed out of the talks. Humphrey narrowly lost, and the war, of course, went on for many years longer. So number one, we would have been out of Vietnam much sooner and with much less, bloodshed. Number two, I think the social safety net of the New Deal and the Great Society would have been strengthened and maybe even expanded under Humphrey. I mean, Nixon, I have to give him credit for environmental laws that no Democrat could have done any better. And in some ways, Nixon looks like a liberal Democrat by today's standards. But Nixon was starting to chip away at the social safety net, and he was certainly appealing to white resentment and to the idea that any programs that ameliorate economic inequality along racial lines must be done at the deficit of white Americans, and Humphrey would not have played that card at all. And I think Humphrey was part of a group of liberal Democrats who'd been trying to get national health insurance back from the time of the Truman administration. And it's not out of the question, just in that specific area, that the next step of the social safety net with Johnson and Humphrey, having created Medicare and Medicaid, might have been some version of national health care.
So actually, the question, I read it wrong. So it's a little bit even more of a ask for you. What would have happened if he had defeated Kennedy for the Democratic nomination in 60?
Oh, in 60? That's an interesting alt history question. I mean, there's no question that Humphrey was way more committed to civil rights than Kennedy was. Kennedy was timid and tactical and only acted on civil rights when absolutely forced by events to do something. And I have no doubt that he never would have gotten his own civil rights bill through Congress. It took Johnson, with all of his political force and wizardry, and it took Humphrey, who was in the Senate, whipping the votes and to help bring all the votes in line to cut off the filibuster, which was really the important thing, and then pass the bill. If Humphrey had been president in 1960, could he have put through civil rights? Probably not. I think his belief in it was absolute, but although he was a very, very skillful legislator, I don't feel from anything I've read that he had the brute force that Johnson had. And I think because Johnson had come out of the border South as a Texan, It gave him also a little bit more political leverage that if Lyndon Johnson was going to champion the civil rights bill, it wasn't going to carry over deep Southerners, but people from some of the border states and upper Midwest states, conservative Republicans who went along with it. Everett Dirksen, Republican senator from Illinois, who brought along some votes. I think Johnson was more able to do that than Humphrey would have been, but not for lack of trying. Kennedy, I think, had no real commitment to civil rights. Humphrey had a deep commitment. I also think that if Humphrey had been elected in 1960, though he was a Cold Warrior, I don't think he would have gotten us stuck in Vietnam the way Kennedy did. If you read The Best and the Brightest, David Halberstam's classic, or Neil Sheehan's book, A Bright Shining Lie, you can see how, awfully John F. Kennedy was getting the United States inserted into Vietnam by like 1962, 1963, much earlier than we tend to associate with the escalation of the war. And I have a hard time imagining Humphrey going that route.
Okay, thank you. One other thing that fascinated me about 1948, and maybe you could talk about it a little bit more, because you had, as you mentioned, Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats leaving. You had the general wisdom that Truman couldn't win. You had Dewey, who was, as you put in your book, not bad on civil rights. I mean, he wasn't.
The Republican Party was
and then
still.
And then you had Henry Wallace, who was even more progressive. For those who may not know, he was sort of the Bernie Sanders of the day.
Yes.
And so, could you talk a little bit more about that dynamic of having those four party, and also the calculations about where Truman would go with civil rights?
It's a great question. I always say that I think there are only 3 white Americans who really, to use current language, put their privilege at risk in the 1940s to really support civil rights, or at least up through the 48 convention, which is a turning point. 1 is Humphrey. I'd say he's first among equals. 2 is Eleanor Roosevelt. And 3 is Henry Wallace, who was booted off FDR's ticket because he was considered too liberal after having been vice president from 1940 to 44. And Wallace was courageous on civil rights. Wallace would go into the South to speak to integrated audiences in segregationist states and give pro-civil rights speeches. And Wallace had a huge amount of support in Black America, because even though Dewey had a pretty good civil rights record as governor of New York State, the reality is that by the 1940s, the Republicans are mostly paying lip service to the idea of being the party of Lincoln, and they're taking Black votes for granted. They're not really pushing on civil rights in any meaningful way, but they still inherit some of the votes of Black Americans. But suddenly Henry Wallace is really active on this. And when I mentioned Cecil Newman, the Black newspaper editor in Minneapolis, who was Humphrey's great friend and partner in progress, Cecil Newman would run these weekly polls of the Black vote in Minnesota, presidential preference, all through 1948. And up until the point Humphrey gives the speech at the convention and the Civil Rights Plank is adopted, Henry Wallace was far and away the most popular candidate among Black voters in Minnesota. And I have no reason to think it would have been much different nationally. So I think Humphrey also, and some of his allies within the party, were aware that they had to compete also against Henry Wallace. Ultimately, and it had begun by this point, Henry Wallace loses a lot of his credibility and salience because he comes out against the Marshall Plan. He really ends up in a way he later admitted was a mistake, has too much truck with the Popular Front and elements of what's left of the Communist Party, in this country. And that was why he and Humphrey had once been great friends and great political mutual supporters have a rupture. But there's no question that thinking about the challenge Wallace presented for Black votes was also part of the calculus. Not just Humphrey, but interestingly, there were a lot of big city political bosses who were not liberal people. They were kind of centrist, I'll give you a garbage can, I'll give you a turkey at Thanksgiving, I'll get your kid a job in the Parks Department, and you'll vote Democratic and you'll let me, make some money, on the side, which was the way big city machines operated. And they really threw their support to Humphrey's civil rights plank in the convention because they were good at counting votes. And they could see that because of the Great Migration, their cities and states, I'm talking about New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, had big burgeoning Black populations, and the Democratic Party needed to compete for those votes.
Absolutely. I mean, really, I encourage everybody to read, the book about the whole panoply of issues that you raised. But to me, it was particularly fascinating the political calculations around that, election. And one of the things that, again, what if, certain things have
Yeah.
happened in history. The the speech was so remarkable. It was courageous at the time because of not only the threats, but there were people that were doing the calculation that said the other way. Well, we're never going to
Yeah.
get those votes, and we need to have the Southern Democrats and the threats against him, and where Truman was, and all that. But I'm thinking if Truman had lost, or if that had not been adopted as a part of the platform, it would still be a tremendous testament to Humphrey's courage. Um, but I think it would have been lost to history. I don't think we would have written a book about it.
It would have been lost history, and it's hard for me to say how many more years would have passed without the Democratic Party embracing civil rights, because even post 1948, Truman is so unpopular in his full term that he can't get the political critical mass to move forward on civil rights other than his executive orders. And then you have in the Democratic Party Adlai Stevenson and John F. Kennedy, who are both much more interested in trying to woo the Southern segregationist wing back into the party, if at all possible. It's sort of in the long run impossible, but they're doing what they can to try to, again, soft pedal civil rights. And so, had 48 not led to the plank, when would it have happened? 64, maybe? It's hard to even run that kind of alt history scenario in my head.
Right. Anyway, Sam, taking enough of your time. Just wonderful to hear you talk about the book. I know you had a tremendous time researching it and put it, a lot of effort into it. It shows in the book. It's a great
Thank you.
read. It's a great story. I encourage everybody to buy it, and everybody have a good rest of your day. And thanks again for Sam for sharing your book with all of us.
Well, thank you, Ken. It's always just a joy and an honor to be with you. And thanks everybody for looking in. And my apologies again for my brief internet-related absence.
Happens. Take care. And thanks, Sam.
You too. Be well, everybody.
You too. Bye.